I only have 1 month to live. Will you travel with me? She whispered, her voice trembling but calm. He was a billionaire, powerful, busy, untouchable, yet blind to the woman who had waited years for his love. But when she spoke those words, his empire meant nothing. He left everything behind, the calls, the meetings, the fame, and followed her. Together they wandered through sunsets and silence, rediscovering the love he once forgot. For the first time he saw her heart, not her shadow. Then came the 30th morning. Her side of the bed was empty, the breeze was soft, but she was gone. Did she die? Did she walk away? Or was love itself too heavy to carry any longer? My beautiful family, this isn't just a story. It's a reminder. Don't wait until time runs out to love deeply. Let's begin with love. I only have 1 month to live. Will you travel with me? Laura Wood spoke those words into the darkness of their bedroom, her voice barely louder than the sound of Nick Brock's breathing beside her. She had rehearsed this moment for weeks, playing out different scenarios in her mind, imagining how he might respond. Would he look at her with indifference? Would he suggest she travel with friends instead? Would he even believe her? The silence that followed her question stretched so long that Laura wondered if he had fallen asleep, if her confession had simply dissolved into the air unheard. Then she felt the bed shift as Nick turned toward her, and in the dim light filtering through their curtains, she saw his eyes open and focus on her face with an intensity she had not witnessed in years. "What did you say?" His voice carried something unfamiliar, something that sounded almost like fear. Laura repeated herself, each word deliberate and weighted with finality. I have 1 month left, maybe less. The doctors gave me the diagnosis 3 weeks ago. I did not tell you right away, because telling you would make it real, and I was not ready for it to be real. But now time is running out, and I need to ask you something before I lose the courage. Will you travel with me? Will you give me 30 days before I'm gone? Nick sat up abruptly, switching on the bedside lamp that flooded their room with harsh light. Laura blinked against the brightness and saw confusion and disbelief warring across her husband's features. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a man trying to form words in a language he had forgotten how to speak. This cannot be happening. You seem fine. You look healthy. When did this start? What kind of diagnosis? Have you gotten a second opinion? The questions tumbled out in a rush, and Laura noticed that even in this moment, even faced with her mortality, Nick's first instinct was to problem solve rather than to feel. She reached for his hand, and when her fingers closed around his, she felt him flinch as though her touch burned. I have seen multiple doctors. They all confirmed the same thing. My body is shutting down from the inside, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. I do not want to spend my remaining time in hospitals fighting a battle I have already lost. I want to see mountains covered in snow. I want to breathe clean air and watch sunsets from places I have only dreamed about. I want to do these things with you if you will come with me. If you cannot, I understand. I know your work is important. I know you have meetings and responsibilities and a company that needs you. But I am asking anyway, one last time, for you to choose me over everything else. The words hung between them like a bridge Laura had built from desperation and dying hope. She watched Nick's face transform as the reality penetrated his initial shock. His eyes, which had grown distant and cold over their years of marriage, suddenly looked wet and raw and human. He pulled her into his arms with a force that surprised her, holding her against his chest so tightly she could feel his heart hammering beneath his skin. Of course I will come with you. I will cancel everything. None of it matters. Nothing matters except you. His voice broke on the last word, and Laura felt moisture on her hair where his face pressed against her head. She could not remember the last time Nick Brock had cried. Could not recall ever seeing him vulnerable enough to let tears fall. They stayed tangled together as the night dissolved into early morning, neither of them sleeping, both of them holding on like drowning people, clinging to the same piece of wreckage. Laura felt relief wash through her body because her desperate gamble had worked. She had lied about dying, had invented a terminal illness to force Nick to finally see her, to finally prioritize her over the empire he had built from nothing. The guilt of her deception pressed against her ribs like a physical weight. But beneath the guilt lived something fiercer and more primal, the satisfaction of finally being important enough to matter. Their marriage had died slowly over 5 years, each day adding another layer of distance between them. Laura could pinpoint the exact moment things changed, could remember the night Nick closed a deal that made him wealthy beyond their wildest college dreams. He had come home victorious, champagne in hand, already talking about the next opportunity, the next mountain to climb. Laura had congratulated him and suggested they celebrate by taking that trip to the coast they had been planning. Nick had looked at her with distracted eyes and said they would go soon, just as soon as he secured the next round of funding. That trip never happened. None of the trips happened. Nick's world expanded outward into boardrooms and conferences, while Laura's world contracted inward into the walls of their mansion. She had tried everything to reach him. She had learned to cook his favorite meals, setting the dining room table with candles and flowers, only to eat alone when he texted that he was working late. She had bought tickets to shows and concerts, holding 2 seats in dark theaters while strangers sat beside her in Nick's empty place. She had suggested therapy, had begged him to take a weekend away with her, had stood in his home office at midnight crying and asking him to please just look at her, really look at her. Nick had perfected the art of being physically present while emotionally absent, of nodding at her words while his mind remained elsewhere, of touching her body without connecting to her soul. Laura had stopped crying about 2 years ago. She had stopped asking and expecting and hoping. She had become a ghost in her own marriage, moving through their expensive rooms like furniture that Nick barely noticed. She had wondered if he would even realize if she disappeared completely, if he would notice her absence or simply move through his days uninterrupted. The thought of dying invisible and unloved had terrified her more than death itself, had driven her to conceive this elaborate fiction. She had researched terminal illnesses, had crafted a diagnosis that would sound legitimate without requiring immediate hospitalization, had given herself a timeline short enough to create urgency, but long enough to truly reconnect with Nick. Now, wrapped in his arms for the first time in months, Laura felt the dual edges of her deception cutting into her heart. She was manipulating him, using fear and guilt to extract the love he had withheld. But she was also giving them both a gift, one final chance to remember what they once meant to each other, one last opportunity to love each other the way they had promised on their wedding day. When morning arrived properly, Nick made calls that Laura overheard from the hallway. He spoke with an authority she rarely heard him use at home, informing his assistant that he was taking a leave of absence, instructing his board members to handle operations without him, canceling meetings that had been scheduled for months. He did all of this without hesitation, without negotiation, and Laura understood that facing her death had finally shaken something loose inside him, had finally broken through the walls he had constructed between himself and genuine emotion. They packed with efficient silence, Nick moving through the closet pulling out warm clothes while Laura watched him from the bed. He kept glancing at her as though afraid she might vanish if he looked away too long, and each glance carried weight that Laura had forgotten existed between them. When they left their mansion in the pre-dawn darkness, neither of them locked the door. Nick simply closed it behind them and walked toward the car without looking back. And Laura realized he was already beginning to shed his old life, already starting to transform into someone new. The flight to Switzerland felt suspended outside normal time. Laura pressed her face against the airplane window, watching clouds drift below them like mountains made of mist, and felt Nick's hand find hers across the armrest. His thumb traced small circles on her skin, a gesture from their early days together that she thought he had forgotten. She closed her eyes and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, Her lie would become the truth that saved them both. Chapter 2. The First Week of Awakening. The village appeared as their car wound through mountain roads that seemed carved from pure winter. Snow covered everything in that particular way that made the world look new and unmarked by human presence. Laura had chosen this place from photographs online, drawn to its remoteness and the promise of silence that cities could never offer. Nick had wanted to book them into one of those luxury resorts with heated pools and celebrity chefs, places where money could insulate them from discomfort. But Laura had insisted on the small cabin on the edge of the village. She needed simplicity. She needed to strip away everything artificial so that what remained between them would be either genuine connection or honest emptiness. Their first morning together arrived with lights so golden it looked borrowed from a painting. Laura woke before Nick and slipped out of bed, wrapping herself in his discarded sweater because it smelled like him, and because the cabin held the kind of cold that made you want to burrow into warmth. She stood on the small balcony and watched the sun transform the snow from blue-white to pink to gold, watching the mountains emerge from shadow into definition. The air hurt her lungs in the best way, sharp and clean, and so different from the filtered atmosphere of their mansion back home. She felt rather than heard Nick join her. He moved behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest, and they stood like that without speaking while the world woke up around them. Laura felt his chin rest on top of her head and realized she could not remember the last time they had stood together in comfortable silence. The last time proximity did not feel like obligation. The moment stretched long enough that she began to catalogue it in her memory, began to collect sensory details she could return to later. The weight of his arms, the sound of his breathing, the particular quality of light that made everything look sacred. "Tell me about your mother," Nick said finally, his voice rough from sleep and altitude. The request startled Laura because Nick knew about her mother, had met her several times before she died, had attended the funeral, and stood beside Laura during the burial. But she understood what he was really asking. He wanted to know the stories he had never bothered to learn, wanted to fill in the gaps his inattention had created. Laura talked while they remained wrapped together against the cold. She told him about her mother's paintings, watercolors of impossible flowers that bloomed in combinations nature never created. She described how her mother would lose herself for hours in creation, humming old gospel songs under her breath while her brush moved across paper. Laura spoke about the day her mother died, suddenly from a heart attack that gave no warning. How 16-year-old Laura had come home from school to find her mother on the kitchen floor still holding a paintbrush, a half-finished flower drying on the table beside her. She told Nick about inheriting her mother's paint set, about carrying those brushes through college and into their marriage, about how the creative impulse inside her had slowly suffocated under the weight of being the perfect wife to an ambitious man. Nick's arms tightened around her when she mentioned her father's death, the funeral he had missed because of a business trip he could not reschedule. Laura had cried alone at the service, had stood beside her father's grave with only Patricia beside her, had returned to their empty house and waited 3 days for Nick to come home. When he finally arrived, he had apologized briefly before diving into emails, and Laura had understood in that moment that grief was something she would always experience in solitude within their marriage. "I should have been there," Nick said into her hair, and Laura heard genuine regret threading through his words. "I convinced myself the business trip mattered more, that your father would understand, that I could make it up to you later. But there is no making up for absence. There is no retroactive presence. I failed you when you needed me most, and I cannot take that back no matter how much I wish I could." Laura turned in his arms to face him and saw tears tracking down his face unchecked. She reached up to wipe them away with her thumbs and felt her own eyes burning in response. "We cannot undo what has already happened. All we have is right now, this moment, these weeks. Let us not waste them mourning the past when we could be building something new in the present. They went into the village later that morning, walking close together through streets that looked pulled from a storybook. Old buildings leaned against each other like elderly friends sharing secrets. Smoke rose from chimneys into air so clear it seemed crystallized. Children played in the snow with that particular abandon that comes from being young enough to believe winter is magic rather than inconvenience. Laura watched everything with hungry eyes, trying to absorb details faster than they appeared, trying to store memories for a future she was not certain she would have. Nick bought her coffee from a small shop where the owner spoke limited English, but made up for it with warmth and gestures. They sat at a table by the window, their hands wrapped around hot cups, their knees touching beneath the table. Laura told him about her childhood dreams of becoming an artist, about the scholarship she had turned down to follow him when his career took him across the country, about the gradual process of convincing herself that supporting his ambitions was more important than pursuing her own. "You gave up everything for me," Nick said, and it was statement rather than question. "You made yourself smaller so I could expand. You erased your own dreams so mine could take up all the space between us. And I let you. I took your sacrifices as my due, as something owed to me, because I was the one earning money and building empires. I treated you like infrastructure rather than like the woman I loved." Laura did not disagree because his assessment was accurate. She had made those choices willingly at first, believing partnership meant supporting each other through different seasons. But seasons had turned into years, and Nick's success had become a permanent condition that required her permanent subordination. She had forgotten herself so thoroughly that she barely recognized her own reflection, saw only the expensive clothes and perfect hair and empty eyes of a woman who had learned to be decorative rather than dimensional. The next day, Nick dragged her to an art supply store tucked down an alley she would never have found alone. The shop smelled like linseed oil and possibility, crammed floor to ceiling, with paints and brushes and canvases in every size. Nick moved through the narrow aisles, pulling down items, while Laura followed in stunned silence. He bought her professional-grade watercolors, brushes made from animal hair she could not pronounce, thick paper that would not buckle under moisture, sketchbooks with creamy pages, pencils in every hardness, and a wooden easel that the shopkeeper promised to deliver to their cabin. "You are buying too much," Laura protested weakly, but Nick shook his head with fierce determination. "I am buying you back the thing I stole. I'm giving you permission to create again, to make messes and mistakes and beautiful things that exist only because you imagined them. Consider it restitution, though no amount of supplies could ever actually repay what I took from you." That afternoon, Laura painted for the first time in years. Nick had set up the easel in the corner of their cabin, where light poured through windows overlooking the mountains. Laura stood before the blank canvas with a brush in her hand and felt terror mixed with exhilaration. Her first strokes were hesitant, rusty, uncertain, but muscle memory lived deeper than conscious thought. And gradually, her hand remembered how to move, how to blend colors, how to transform blank white into something that captured the world as she saw it, rather than as it objectively existed. She painted the mountains, but made them purple and gold instead of realistic white and gray. She painted their cabin with smoke rising from the chimney in spirals that looked like music made visible. She painted Nick sitting in the chair by the fireplace, with a book he was not really reading, his eyes distant and thoughtful, his face more relaxed than she had seen it in years. When she finally stepped back from the canvas hours later, her back aching and her fingers cramped, she felt more alive than she had felt since her wedding day. Nick came to stand beside her, studying what she had created with genuine attention. "You painted me smiling?" "I did not realize I was smiling." "You were not," Laura admitted. "But I painted who you are becoming, rather than who you have been. I painted the version of you I used to know, the one who laughed easily and noticed small beauties and believed happiness was as important as achievement. Nick pulled her against his side, and they looked at the painting together in silence. Laura felt his chest rise and fall, with breathing that seemed less burdened than before, as though their time here was slowly removing layers of armor he had been carrying without realizing the weight. She leaned into him and let herself imagine a future where they could sustain this version of themselves, this softer and more genuine way of existing together. The fantasy felt fragile as spun sugar, beautiful but likely to shatter at the first touch of reality. Their fifth morning together, Laura woke him before dawn with insistence that bordered on playful. She bundled them both into layers of warm clothes and pulled him outside while stars still pierced the fading darkness. They walked to the edge of the village where civilization ended and wilderness began, where the only sounds were wind moving through pine trees and their own breathing visible in cold air. Laura positioned them facing east, and they waited in companionable silence while the sky shifted through shades of purple and pink before the sun finally broke above the mountains. "You used to do this for me when we were dating," Laura said softly. "You would wake me up to watch sunrise and say that every day with me was worth celebrating from the very first moment. You said that sleeping through dawn was like throwing away the best part of being alive. I waited 5 years for you to remember that version of yourself, for you to remember that time could be spent instead of just managed. Now here we are, watching the world wake up together, and I feel like I'm meeting you again for the first time." Nick turned to her with such intensity that Laura felt pinned beneath the weight of his gaze. "I forgot how to be human somewhere along the way. I forgot that meaning comes from moments rather than milestones. I forgot that you were the reason I wanted success in the first place, that all of it was supposed to be for us, not instead of us. Standing here with you now, watching your face in this light, I cannot comprehend how I convinced myself that anything else mattered more than this." He kissed her then, and the kiss tasted like cold air and salt from tears Laura did not realize were falling. She kissed him back with desperation and relief, and the particular grief that comes from knowing something beautiful is temporary, that even perfect moments must eventually end. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying openly, their tears freezing on their cheeks in the frigid air. The first week dissolved into a rhythm that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. They woke together and fell asleep tangled in each other. They cooked simple meals in the cabin's tiny kitchen, laughing at their own incompetence and eating burned offerings with genuine enjoyment. They walked for miles through snow-covered landscapes, their conversations ranging from profound to absurd, reconnecting to the ease they had shared before ambition poisoned their intimacy. Nick read books he bought from the village bookstore while Laura painted, and occasionally he would read passages aloud that struck him as important, and Laura would stop painting to discuss philosophy or poetry or whatever had captured his attention. By the end of their first week, they were no longer strangers inhabiting the same space. They had become something fragile and new, two people learning to love each other intentionally rather than accidentally, discovering that marriage required attention and effort, and the willingness to show up even when showing up meant vulnerability. Laura knew the foundation they were building rested on the lie of her invented illness, knew that truth would eventually demand accounting. But she pushed those thoughts away and let herself live inside the beautiful fiction they were creating together, collecting moments like treasures against the coming devastation. Chapter 3. The second week of confession. The second week arrived with weather that matched the emotional landscape Laura had been avoiding. Clouds gathered over the mountains, like thoughts too heavy to remain suspended in air, and the temperature dropped until even their heated cabin felt besieged by cold, pressing against the windows. Nick suggested they stay inside, where warmth and comfort could insulate them from the harshness beyond their walls, but Laura refused. She needed to walk, needed movement and biting air to give her courage for the confession she had been postponing since their arrival. They dressed in layers and ventured out into morning that felt more like twilight. The sun, hidden behind cloud cover so thick it turned the world grey and muted. Laura led them away from the village, along a path she had discovered during one of her solo walks. A trail that wound through forest before opening onto a frozen lake that looked like a mirror, abandoned by some giant and left to gather frost. They walked in silence, their breath creating small clouds that dissipated almost before forming, and Laura felt the weight of unspoken truth growing heavier with each step. When they reached the lake, Laura sat on a wooden bench someone had placed at the water's edge, probably for summer tourists who came to admire reflection and beauty. Now the lake offered only stillness and the particular emptiness of winter landscapes. Nick sat beside her close enough that their shoulders touched, and Laura drew strength from that small point of contact before she began speaking words she had been holding inside for years. "I need to tell you about the babies we lost," Laura said, and she felt Nick go rigid beside her. "I need you to know what happened when you were not there, what I survived alone, while you were building your empire in cities whose names I cannot even remember now." She told him about the first miscarriage that happened barely a year into their marriage. Laura had just discovered she was pregnant and had planned an elaborate surprise for Nick, buying tiny shoes and wrapping them in a box she intended to give him at dinner. But her body had rejected the pregnancy before she could reveal the secret, cramping and bleeding, starting in the middle of an ordinary afternoon while she stood in their kitchen trying to decide what to cook. She had called Nick in panic and pain, her voice breaking as she tried to explain what was happening, and he had promised to catch the first flight home. But his assistant had convinced him the meeting he was attending could not be rescheduled, that millions of dollars hinged on his presence, that Laura would be fine until he returned. So Laura had driven herself to the hospital, had sat alone in sterile waiting rooms while doctors confirmed what her body already knew. She had returned to their empty house and cleaned up the evidence of their lost child, disposing of tiny shoes that would never be worn. And when Nick finally came home 2 days later, full of apologies and exhaustion, Laura had simply nodded and said she understood. The second miscarriage came during their 3rd year together, and this time Laura had not called Nick at all. She had learned that his work would always take precedence, that asking him to choose her was asking him to betray the identity he had constructed around success and achievement. She had bled and grieved alone in their master bathroom, holding her own hand because no one else was there to hold it for her. And when Nick returned from whatever trip had seemed so important, Laura told him matter-of-factly that they had lost another baby. He had held her and said he was sorry, but his sorrow felt abstract and distant. Sympathy for suffering he did not truly comprehend because he had not witnessed it. The third loss happened so early that Laura was not certain it qualified as miscarriage or simply her period arriving late and heavy. But she had felt life beginning inside her, had recognized the particular way her body changed when creating something new. And when that potential life dissolved before it could take shape, Laura mourned it as completely as she had mourned the others. She never told Nick about the third loss at all, because by then she understood that her grief was hers alone to carry, that marriage did not automatically mean shared burden. 3 times my body tried to make us into parents, Laura continued, her voice steady, though tears streamed down her frozen cheeks. 3 times I waited for you to be present, to hold my hand and tell me we would survive this together. 3 times I learned that I was alone in every way that mattered. Do you understand what that did to me? Do you comprehend how many small deaths I experienced while you were busy becoming successful? Nick had fallen to his knees in the snow before Laura finished speaking. His face had collapsed into anguish so raw it looked painful, and sounds were coming from his throat that resembled sobbing but sounded more animal than human. He pressed his face against her lap, and his entire body shook with the force of grief that had been delayed by years of ignorance. Laura placed her hand on his head, her fingers threading through his hair, and she felt no satisfaction in his pain, only the exhausting relief of finally being witnessed in her suffering. "I am sorry," Nick gasped between sobs. "I'm so deeply, unforgivably sorry. I abandoned you when you needed me most. I chose deals and meetings over your pain. I let you grieve our children alone because I convinced myself that money mattered more than presence. I cannot take back those choices. I cannot undo the damage I caused. But I need you to know that I would give everything I own, everything I built, to go back and be there for you. I would trade every dollar for one chance to hold your hand through that suffering." Laura pulled him up from the snow and held him while he cried against her shoulder, and she found herself crying too, not from fresh pain, but from the strange comfort of finally being allowed to speak her grief aloud and have it acknowledged. They stayed locked together until the cold became unbearable, until their tears froze on their faces and their bodies trembled from exposure rather than emotion. Only then did they pull apart and begin the long walk back to their cabin, holding hands so tightly their fingers went numb. That evening, they lay in bed facing each other in darkness, pierced only by moonlight filtering through curtains. Nick traced Laura's face with his fingertips, like a blind man learning to recognize beauty through touch alone. And Laura let herself be studied, let herself be seen in a way she had not permitted since their marriage began its slow deterioration. "I forgave you for the absences long before tonight," Laura whispered into the small space between their faces. "I forgave you because holding anger felt like dying twice, once from the loss of our babies and again from the poison of resentment. But forgiving you did not erase what happened. It did not restore the trust I lost when you chose work over me repeatedly. It did not heal the part of me that learned to expect disappointment whenever I needed you most." Nick pressed his forehead against hers, and she felt wetness that might have been his tears or hers or both combined. "I do not know how to fix what I broke. I do not know if broken trust can ever become whole again, or if it just becomes something different, something scarred and imperfect, but still functional. All I know is that I want to spend whatever time we have left proving that I am capable of showing up, of choosing you, of being the partner I should have been from the beginning." They made love that night with a tenderness that felt almost sacred. And afterward, Laura lay awake long after Nick's breathing deepened into sleep. She stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of her deception pressing against her chest. She had manipulated him with fiction of dying, had weaponized his guilt and fear to extract the attention she craved. Part of her wondered if this made her as culpable as him, if her lie was equivalent to his years of neglect. But a deeper part of her believed that desperate people did desperate things, that she had used the only tool available to make herself visible to a man who had stopped seeing her. The next morning brought unexpected beauty. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering the world in pristine white that made everything look renewed and innocent. They visited a small chapel in the village center, a building so old its stones seemed to hold centuries of prayer and grief and joy. Laura had not been inside a church since her father's funeral, and entering this quiet space brought memories flooding back with such force she had to steady herself against a pew. "I want to light candles for our babies," Laura said, and her voice echoed slightly in the empty chapel. "I want to give them some small acknowledgement, some moment where their brief, almost existence is honored." Nick bought 3 candles from the elderly woman keeping watch near the entrance, and together they approached the altar where dozens of small flames already flickered in red glass holders. They lit their candles one at a time, each flame representing a life that never took its first breath, and Laura felt grief wash through her, clean and sharp and somehow less heavy than before. Nick stood beside her with his head bowed and his lips moving in what looked like prayer, though Laura had never known him to be religious. She wondered what promises he was making, what bargains he was attempting to strike with whatever divine force might be listening. They sat in the pews long after their candles burned down to nothing, sitting in silence that felt full rather than empty, and Laura understood that some losses could never be fixed or forgotten, but could be survived. She understood that grief did not disappear, but could be integrated, woven into the fabric of who you became, rather than remaining an open wound that never healed. When they finally left the chapel, Laura felt lighter in a way she had not felt since before her first miscarriage, as though confession and acknowledgement had released something she had been carrying unconsciously. That afternoon, Nick surprised her by taking her to a small theater tucked into a side street she would never have discovered alone. He had asked around the village until someone mentioned that a traveling classical ensemble was performing, and he had secured tickets without telling Laura, wanting to give her the gift of unexpected beauty. They sat in a theater that held perhaps 50 people, the intimate space making the music feel immediate and vital. When the cellist began to play, Laura felt something crack open inside her chest. Her mother had played cello before arthritis stole her ability to hold the instrument properly. Laura had grown up falling asleep to the sound of her mother practicing scales and melodies, had associated that particular rich voice of the cello with safety and love. After her mother died, Laura had never been able to listen to cello music without crying, so she had simply avoided it entirely, protecting herself from grief by denying herself beauty. But now, sitting beside Nick in this small theater, while the musician drew impossible sounds from wood and strings, Laura let herself cry without shame or embarrassment. She cried for her mother and for her lost babies, and for the years she had wasted being invisible in her own marriage. She cried from grief and from relief and from the strange joy that comes from allowing yourself to feel everything instead of nothing. Nick held her hand throughout the performance and did not try to stop her tears or ask if she was all right. He simply bore witness to her grief, offered his presence without trying to fix or minimize what she was experiencing, and Laura understood that this was what love actually meant. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but the willingness to sit beside someone in their pain and not look away, not make it about yourself, not try to rush them toward healing before they were ready. When the performance ended and they walked back to their cabin through snow that glittered under streetlights, Laura felt fundamentally altered. The second week had excavated old wounds and examined them in light instead of letting them fester in darkness. She had given Nick her grief, and he had received it without defensiveness, had absorbed her pain and carried it with her instead of making her bear it alone. They were building something real now, something honest, and Laura felt terror mixed with hope because she knew the foundation included her lie, knew that eventually truth would demand its reckoning. Chapter 4. The third and fourth weeks of falling again. The third week felt suspended outside normal time, as though they had stepped through some invisible barrier into a world where clocks moved differently, and ordinary rules no longer applied. Laura woke each morning with the strange sensation of living inside a dream she might wake from at any moment, and she clung to Nick with increasing desperation, trying to memorize the feeling of his arms around her before everything inevitably fell apart. They traveled to different villages scattered throughout the region, taking trains that wound through mountain passes so beautiful they made Laura's chest ache. She photographed everything obsessively with an old camera she found in a flea market, wanting physical proof that these days existed, that this version of them was real and not just fantasy constructed from loneliness and lies. Nick appeared in most of her photographs, often unaware she was capturing him, his face more open and peaceful than she had seen it since their college days. He looked younger somehow, as though shedding his identity as a ruthless businessman had reversed the aging process, had restored something essential that success had slowly eroded. In one village built into a hillside, overlooking a valley that looked painted rather than real, they encountered a street artist who offered to paint their portrait together. Laura wanted to refuse, feeling that preserving this moment might somehow curse it, but Nick agreed before she could protest. They sat close on a stone wall while the artist studied them, with eyes that seemed to see past surface into something deeper. His hands moved quickly across canvas, mixing colors and applying paint with confidence that came from years of practice. When he finally turned the portrait around for them to see, Laura felt her breath catch. He had painted them touching foreheads, Nick's hand cupping her face, her eyes closed in an expression of complete trust. They looked like people who had loved each other across lifetimes, who had found each other repeatedly through different incarnations because their souls recognized each other, regardless of circumstances. "You two have the look of people who almost lost each other but found your way back," the artist said in accented English. "That kind of love is rare. It survives because it chooses to survive, not because it is easy." Laura bought the portrait and carried it carefully back to their cabin, treating it like the most precious possession she owned. She propped it against the wall where she could see it from their bed, and that night she stared at the painting while Nick slept beside her, wondering how something built on deception could feel so true. The days blurred together in the best possible way. They woke tangled in each other and fell asleep the same way. They cooked meals that tasted better than expensive restaurant food because they made them together, laughing at their mistakes and inventing ridiculous recipes. They walked for miles through landscapes that seemed designed specifically to make humans feel small and grateful. They talked about everything and nothing, reclaiming the ease they had shared before ambition poisoned their intimacy. Nick read to her in the evenings while she painted, his voice turning poetry and philosophy into music. He would occasionally stop reading to share a passage that struck him as important, and they would discuss meaning and interpretation until late into the night. Laura painted constantly during this week, producing canvas after canvas that captured not just what she saw, but what she felt. She painted Nick sleeping with one hand reaching toward where she should be. She painted the mountains at different times of day, each version reflecting her shifting emotional state. She painted abstract pieces that expressed love and fear and guilt in colors that had no names. On one particularly beautiful afternoon, they hiked to a waterfall that somehow had not frozen completely, water still cascading down rocks in defiance of winter's grip. They sat on a boulder at the base of the falls, the sound drowning out everything except the beating of their own hearts. Nick turned to Laura with an expression so vulnerable it made her want to look away. "When you die," he said, and Laura felt the words like a physical blow, even though she knew they referred to her invented illness. "I will not survive it. I know that sounds dramatic, but I am being literal. The man I was before these weeks with you will cease to exist because he cannot exist in a world without you. I do not know what version of myself will emerge from that loss, but I know he will be fundamentally different from who I am now or who I was before." Laura wanted to confess everything in that moment. She wanted to tell him the truth about her lie, wanted to explain her desperation and fear and the calculations that led her to this deception. But she looked at his face full of love and dread, and she could not bring herself to shatter the fragile world they had built. So instead she kissed him, pouring everything unsaid into that kiss, trying to communicate through touch what she could not express in words. The fourth week arrived too quickly, time accelerating as it always does when you want it to slow down. Laura began to deliberately tire herself, to simulate the symptoms of illness she had claimed to suffer. She slept later and napped during the day. She walked more slowly and let Nick see her wince occasionally, as though pain was beginning to infiltrate her body. She ate less, pushing food around her plate while claiming her appetite had diminished. Nick watched her with increasing alarm, his eyes tracking her every movement like he was trying to memorize her before she vanished. "I do not want to go to a hospital," Laura told him when he suggested seeking medical attention. I do not want to spend whatever time remains in sterile rooms under artificial light, being poked and prodded by doctors who cannot help me anyway. I want to stay here with you, in this place we found together. And I want to let nature take its course in the most beautiful setting possible. Nick did not argue, though she could see the conflict in his face. The war between respecting her wishes and his desperate desire to do something, anything, to prevent the ending they both believed was coming. They spent more time in the cabin during this week, Laura claiming cold and exhaustion made outdoor adventures difficult. Nick built fires in the fireplace and read to her while she lay on the couch wrapped in blankets. And sometimes Laura would fall asleep to the sound of his voice and wake to find him watching her with an expression that combined love and grief so thoroughly she could not distinguish between them. One evening, they made promises to each other that felt more binding than their wedding vows had been. They returned to the frozen lake where Laura had confessed about the miscarriages, and they stood at the water's edge while the sun set behind mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that looked almost artificial in their intensity. I promise to never forget that you came back to me when it mattered most, Laura said, her voice carrying across the frozen expanse. I promise to remember these weeks as the best of my life, as proof that love can be reclaimed even after it seems lost beyond recovery. I promise to forgive you completely for every absence, every neglected moment, every time you chose work over me, because these 30 days have given me more genuine connection than many people experience in entire lifetimes. Nick took her hands in his, and she could feel him trembling, though she was not certain if it came from cold or emotion. I promise that even after you are gone, I will live differently. I will love better. I will honor your memory by becoming the man you always believed I could be, even when I did not believe it myself. I promise to carry you with me in every decision, to ask myself if what I am doing would make you proud, to never again forget that how we love matters more than what we achieve. They sealed their promises with a kiss that tasted like goodbye, and Laura felt her deception weighing on her soul like stones in her pockets. She was giving him beautiful lies wrapped in genuine emotion, and she did not know if that made her cruel or kind or simply human. They walked back to the cabin holding each other up, and that night they made love with desperate intensity, as though they could somehow merge their bodies completely and become one entity that death could not separate. The final days of their 30 days together passed in a haze of emotion that left Laura feeling wrung out and raw. She increased her simulation of illness, spending most of one day in bed while Nick sat beside her reading aloud from books she was not really hearing. She let him see her cry from what he believed was pain, but was actually guilt so intense it felt like physical suffering. She watched him care for her with such tenderness and devotion, and she understood that she had accomplished exactly what she set out to do. She had made herself visible to him again. She had reminded him how to love her. But the cost of that accomplishment was a lie so enormous that its eventual revelation might destroy everything they had rebuilt. On what they both believed was her final night, Laura stayed awake until the early hours of morning, watching Nick sleep beside her. She memorized the rise and fall of his chest, the way his face relaxed in sleep, the particular way his hand rested on her hip, like even unconscious he needed to maintain contact. She had written 2 letters, one that she would leave for him to find when he woke, one that she had given to Patricia with instructions to deliver it weeks later when Laura's money ran out and she could no longer hide. The first letter maintained the fiction of her dying, gave him closure and permission to move on. The second letter confessed everything and begged for understanding she was not certain she deserved. When dawn began to lighten the sky outside their window, Laura carefully extracted herself from Nick's arms. She had already packed her few belongings the night before, had arranged for a car to meet her at the edge of the village. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, gathering the last items she needed, And then she stood beside their bed, looking down at Nick's sleeping face. She wanted to touch him one more time, wanted to kiss him goodbye, but she knew that any contact might wake him and ruin the clean departure she had planned. So instead, she placed the letter on the pillow where her head should have been, and she whispered words he could not hear. I love you more than truth. I love you more than honesty. I love you enough to lie if lying means you see me again. I'm sorry for what I have done. I am sorry for what I am about to do. But I cannot let you watch me pretend to die, cannot let the fiction continue until you realize it is fiction. I'm giving us both the ending we need, even if it destroys us in the process. Laura left the cabin as the sun rose, walking away from the only happiness she had known in years. Walking away from the man she loved because she loved him too much to let him discover her deception. She got into the waiting car without looking back. And she did not allow herself to cry until they were miles away, until the village disappeared behind mountains, and she knew there was no turning back from what she had set in motion. Chapter 5. The Vanishing and the Collapse. Nick woke to wrongness that his body recognized before his mind could articulate what felt different. The bed beside him was cold. Not just empty, but cold in a way that suggested hours of absence rather than minutes. He reached across the mattress, expecting to find Laura's warmth, and instead encountered sheets that held no memory of her body. His eyes opened fully, and he sat up, his heart already beginning to accelerate, with a panic he did not yet understand the source of. "Laura?" His voice sounded too loud in the empty cabin, bouncing off walls and returning to him unanswered. He called her name again, louder this time, with more urgency. Silence replied. Nick threw off the covers and moved through the cabin with increasing franticness, checking the bathroom where her toothbrush was gone, opening the closet where her clothes had vanished, searching the small kitchen where no note explained her absence. Everything belonging to Laura had been systematically removed, as though she had never existed here at all. Then he saw the envelope on her pillow, his name written in her distinctive handwriting across the front. Nick picked it up with hands that had begun to shake, and he felt dread opening like a chasm in his chest. He tore open the envelope and pulled out pages covered in Laura's careful script, and as he read, his world collapsed into itself, like a building being demolished from the inside. She had written that she loved him too much to let him watch her die, that these 30 days were the most beautiful gift anyone had ever given her, that he had made her feel alive and seen and cherished. She wrote that she could not bear for his last memories of her to be suffering and decline, could not allow him to witness her body failing and her spirit diminishing. She begged him not to search for her, told him to return to his life and remember her as she was in Switzerland, happy and whole and complete. She thanked him for finding her again before it was too late, for proving that their love could be reclaimed even after years of neglect. She signed the letter with declarations of love that would have been beautiful if they were not also goodbyes. Nick read the letter until the words blurred together, until he had memorized every line, and then he read it again, because reading kept him connected to her somehow, kept her voice alive in his head. When he finally accepted that reading would not bring her back, he began tearing through the cabin, looking for any clue she might have left behind, any indication of where she had gone. He found nothing except the paintings she had created during their time together, canvases that now looked like messages from someone already dead. He called her phone and reached a disconnected number. He ran to the village, asking everyone if they had seen her, showing her picture to shopkeepers and strangers who shook their heads with sympathy, but no information. He contacted every hospital within driving distance, certain she had collapsed somewhere and was dying alone without him. The hospitals had no record of anyone matching her description. He went to the police station and tried to file a missing person report, but the officer explained gently that an adult leaving her husband voluntarily was not a crime, that they could not force someone to be found if they did not want to be. Nick spent 3 days in a state of complete devastation. barely eating or sleeping, searching the surrounding areas with manic determination. He hired a car and drove to neighboring villages asking about Laura, showing her photograph until his voice went hoarse from repetition. He checked hotels and bus stations and train depots, everywhere and anywhere she might have passed through. A clerk at one small hotel thought she recognized Laura, said a woman matching that description had checked in briefly before leaving with a man in a dark car. The information sent Nick's mind spiraling because suddenly he wondered if everything had been a lie. If Laura had used him for 30 days of luxury before running off with someone else. If the illness was fiction and the love was performance. He returned to their cabin and sat surrounded by her paintings, trying to reconcile the woman who created these intimate portraits with someone capable of such elaborate deception. He found the journal he had been keeping during their time together, the record Laura had asked him to write so he would never forget these weeks. He read his own words, describing her laughter and vulnerability, and the way she looked at him like he was her entire world. And he could not make sense of a reality where that woman would simply disappear without explanation. When Nick finally flew back home, he moved through his mansion like a ghost haunting his own life. Everything reminded him of Laura, but a Laura who existed in a different timeline, a version of their marriage before Switzerland transformed everything. He wandered into her painting studio, the room she had abandoned years ago when his success made her dreams seem insignificant, and he found old canvases stacked against walls, half-finished paintings of flowers that looked like her mother's impossible blooms. He sat on the floor of that dusty room and wept with a violence that left him gasping for air. His assistant came by the house trying to brief him on the business, showing him documents that required his signature and decisions that could not wait any longer. Nick looked at the papers and felt nothing except contempt for the life he had built at Laura's expense. He told his assistant to handle everything, that he did not care what happened to the company, that all of it meant nothing without her. The assistant left looking concerned and confused, and Nick did not blame him because he barely recognized himself anymore. He stopped eating regularly and lost weight with alarming speed. He stopped sleeping more than a few hours each night, his dreams filled with Laura disappearing over and over in increasingly horrific ways. He sat in their bedroom, holding her clothes and breathing in her scent until it faded from the fabric and all he could smell was his own desperate grief. His phone rang constantly with calls from board members and lawyers and people whose names he could not remember. But he let everything go to voicemail because none of it mattered if Laura was dying somewhere alone, thinking he had abandoned her again. 3 weeks after returning home, Patricia appeared at his door. She was Laura's oldest friend, the woman who had stood beside her at their wedding and held her hand through miscarriages while Nick was absent. Patricia looked at him with an expression combining pity and anger, and Nick knew before she spoke that whatever she was about to say would change everything. She asked to come inside, and Nick led her to his study where he had been spending most of his time, surrounded by the journal from Switzerland and photographs of Laura from happier days. Patricia sat across from him and studied his face like she was deciding whether he could handle what she needed to tell him. Nick waited in silence because rushing her felt pointless when his entire world had already collapsed. "Laura is not dying," Patricia said finally, and Nick felt those 4 words like a physical blow. "There is no terminal illness. There never was. She lied to you because it was the only way she could think of to make you see her again before she left you permanently." Nick could not process what he was hearing. His mind rejected the information because accepting it meant reconstructing his entire understanding of the past month. Patricia continued talking, explaining that Laura had fabricated the diagnosis to force Nick to choose her over his work, that the 30-day timeline was manufactured to create urgency and intensity, that everything had been calculated to extract one final experience of genuine love before Laura walked away from their marriage forever. She was not dying physically, but she was dying inside your marriage, Patricia said, and her voice carried no sympathy for Nick's shock. She spent 5 years becoming invisible while you chased success. She tried everything to reach you, and you ignored every attempt. So she lied, she invented a dramatic crisis, because drama was the only thing that could penetrate your obsession with work. And it worked, did it not? You finally saw her. You finally chose her. You finally loved her the way you should have been loving her all along. Nick felt rage rising through his shock. Anger at being manipulated, fury at Laura for putting him through the horror of believing she was dying. But underneath the anger lived something more complicated. A recognition that her deception was born from desperation. That she had weaponized his guilt because guilt was the only tool she had left. "Where is she?" Nick demanded, his voice shaking with emotion he could not name. "I need to see her. I need to talk to her." Patricia shook her head. "She made me promise not to tell you her location. She disappeared because she convinced herself you only loved her out of pity, that your tenderness in Switzerland was obligation rather than genuine feeling. She could not bear watching your love turn to disgust when you discovered the truth. So she left before you could reject her." Patricia handed him another letter, one Laura had written for Patricia to deliver after enough time had passed. Nick took it with trembling hands and read words full of apology and explanation. Laura begging him to understand that the lie came from desperate love rather than malicious intent. She wrote that she knew he would hate her when he learned the truth, that she understood she had become the villain in their story. But she wanted him to know that the 30 days were real for her, even if the illness was fiction. Every moment of connection had been genuine. Every touch had carried real love. The foundation might have been false, but the building constructed upon it was true. Nick finished reading and looked up at Patricia with eyes that burned from unshed tears. "She was wrong. She is wrong. I do not love her from pity or obligation. I love her because those 30 days reminded me who she is and who we used to be. I love her because she fought for us when I had given up. Her lie does not diminish my feelings. If anything, it proves how much she needed me, and I failed her so completely that lying seemed like her only option." Patricia's expression softened slightly. "Then you need to tell her that yourself, but I cannot help you find her. She liquidated her accounts and disappeared completely. She could be anywhere." Nick stood up and felt determination replacing despair in his chest. "Then I will search everywhere. I will look in every city until I find her. I will not stop until I can look her in the eyes and tell her that my love is real, that Switzerland changed me permanently, that I forgive her completely because I understand why she felt she had no other choice." Patricia studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "She told me you would give up after a few weeks, that you would decide she was not worth the effort. I told her she was wrong about you, that underneath the cold businessman lived the man she fell in love with. I hope I was right." After Patricia left, Nick sat alone in his study and felt his old life falling away like skin being shed. He understood in that moment that finding Laura would require becoming someone new, someone who valued love over success, someone who would sacrifice everything comfortable and familiar for the chance to prove his devotion was real. He looked around at his expensive office and his luxury home, and all the markers of achievement he had accumulated, and he felt nothing except eagerness to abandon it all in pursuit of the only thing that had ever truly mattered. Chapter 6. The Destruction of an Empire. Nick Brock became a man with singular purpose. Within hours of Patricia's departure, he had hired 3 separate investigation firms, each one promising results that the others could not deliver. He gave them everything he knew about Laura, every detail of their life together, every habit and preference and fear. He authorized unlimited budgets and demanded daily updates. The investigators fanned out across the country, following leads that dissolved into nothing before they could be properly examined. The first firm reported back within days. They had traced Laura's movements to a bus station, where she purchased a ticket heading west, But the trail ended there, in a tangle of cash transactions that left no digital footprint. The second firm found a woman matching Laura's description, working temporarily at a diner 3 states away. But when Nick flew there himself, the woman turned out to be a stranger who happened to share similar features. The third firm admitted after 2 weeks that Laura had covered her tracks with unexpected sophistication, that she had clearly planned her disappearance with care and intelligence. Nick increased the search efforts, pouring money into the investigation like water disappearing into sand. He stopped attending meetings entirely, stopped responding to emails, stopped pretending that anything else in his life held meaning. His assistant appeared at his door with increasingly urgent messages about decisions that required his attention, contracts that needed signatures, crises that demanded immediate response. Nick looked at these problems that once would have consumed him and felt nothing except irritation that they were distracting him from his real work. His board of directors called an emergency meeting and summoned Nick to attend. He went because refusing would have required energy he needed for other things. They sat around a conference table in a room designed to intimidate and impress, and they spoke to him with careful voices about his prolonged absence and declining performance. They showed him charts illustrating falling stock prices and lost contracts. They explained that competitors were circling, that key employees were leaving, that the empire he built was crumbling without his leadership. Nick listened to their concerns and felt detached from the panic in their voices. When they finished speaking, he told them to do whatever they wanted. Sell the company, dissolve it, find new leadership. He did not care anymore. The board members stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to anger, but Nick stood and left the room before anyone could formulate a response. He walked out of the building that bore his name and never looked back. His lawyers contacted him with frantic calls about the legal implications of abandoning his responsibilities. His accountant sent detailed projections showing how quickly Nick was burning through his wealth, how unsustainable his current spending had become. Within 6 months at this rate, he would exhaust most of his liquid assets. Within a year, he might lose everything he had worked decades to accumulate. Nick signed documents authorizing the sale of his interests to a competitor for a fraction of their actual value. And he felt relief rather than regret. He was shedding the identity he had constructed so carefully, removing layers of ambition and status until only the essential core remained. That core was simple and uncomplicated. He was a man who loved his wife. He was a husband searching for the woman he had failed. Everything else was just noise and distraction. 3 months into his search, the investigation firms had produced nothing except bills and excuses. They had followed countless false leads, interviewed hundreds of people, examined records and footage and testimonies that all led nowhere. Laura had vanished as completely as smoke, leaving behind no trail that professional investigators could follow. Nick understood then that strangers could not find her, that no amount of money could purchase what only love could accomplish. The investigators were looking for a missing person. Nick was looking for the other half of his soul. He dismissed all 3 firms and began preparing for a different kind of search. He withdrew cash from his accounts and divided it into small amounts he could carry. He packed a single bag with essential items and added Laura's photograph, the journal from Switzerland, and nothing else that mattered. He looked around his mansion one final time, seeing it as Laura must have seen it during their marriage. A beautiful prison where she had slowly disappeared while he chased things that meant nothing. He left without locking the door and walked away from luxury with the same ease most people displayed walking away from garbage. His expensive car sat in the driveway, but Nick ignored it, choosing instead to walk to the bus station because he wanted to understand what Laura's life must be like now. Wanted to experience the world from her perspective rather than from his position of wealth and privilege. The search that followed consumed him entirely. Nick moved from city to city with no plan except to keep moving, to cover ground, to show Laura's picture to every stranger willing to look. He stopped using credit cards because he wanted to understand survival on limited resources. He rationed his cash carefully, sleeping in cheap motels when he could afford them, sleeping in his car when he could not. He ate one meal each day and accepted hunger as the price of continuing the search. He asked the same question thousands of times in hundreds of locations. "Have you seen this woman?" Most people barely glanced at the photograph before shaking their heads and moving on with their lives. Some looked longer, their faces softening with sympathy for his obvious desperation, but they had no information to offer. A few asked why he was searching with such intensity, and Nick would simply reply that she was his wife and he needed to tell her something important. The responses varied. Older women sometimes touched his arm gently and wished him luck, with voices that suggested they understood something about love and loss. Men his age often looked at him like he was pathetic, wasting his life on a woman who clearly did not want to be found. Younger people mostly ignored him entirely, too absorbed in their own concerns to care about a stranger's quest. The search aged Nick with brutal efficiency. The constant stress, the poor nutrition, the endless walking, the sleepless nights spent wondering if Laura was safe, all of it carved years into his face. His hair began turning grey within the first month. Deep lines appeared around his eyes and mouth, aging him beyond his years. His body grew lean from walking countless miles, his muscles becoming hard and defined, while his face hollowed out from inadequate food. He stopped maintaining his appearance because grooming felt pointless when every moment should be spent searching. His expensive clothes wore out, and he replaced them with cheap alternatives from discount stores. His shoes developed holes that let in water and cold. His hands, once soft from years of desk work, became calloused and scarred from odd jobs he took to earn enough money to continue. 4 months into his journey, Nick's financial situation became critical. The cash he had withdrawn was nearly depleted. He started taking whatever work he could find that paid immediately. He washed dishes in restaurant kitchens, earning barely enough for food. He helped on construction sites when his body allowed, though he lacked the skills and strength of men who did physical labor regularly. He cleaned stores after hours for minimum wage, mopping floors and emptying trash while thinking about Laura and wondering where she was sleeping that night. His transformation was so complete that he no longer recognized himself in mirrors. The billionaire entrepreneur had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who looked homeless and desperate. But Nick did not mourn his lost identity. He felt more authentic now than he had felt in years, more connected to what actually mattered. He was no longer performing success for an audience that did not care. He was simply being honest about his priorities. And that honesty looked like a man willing to sacrifice everything comfortable for the chance to tell his wife that he loved her. 5 months in, Nick experienced moments of doubt that threatened to overwhelm his determination. He stood in a park watching families play together, watching couples walk hand in hand, and he wondered if everyone was right, if he was destroying himself for nothing, if Laura had moved on and built a new life that did not include him. But every time doubt crept in, he would pull out Laura's photograph and look at her face, and he would remember Switzerland and the way she looked at him like he was her entire world. He would remember her confession about the miscarriages and the grief she carried alone. He would remember how completely he had failed her, and failure would reignite his determination to succeed at the only thing that truly mattered. He continued moving forward because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant accepting a future without Laura, which was not a future worth having. He walked until his feet bled. He searched until his voice grew hoarse. He showed her picture until the photograph itself began to deteriorate from constant handling. And through it all, he held on to one truth that kept him moving when everything else told him to quit. Laura was out there somewhere. She was alive. And eventually, if he searched long enough and refused to surrender, he would find her. Chapter 7: The Degradation and Mockery. 6 months into his search, Nick Brock had become unrecognizable even to himself. The man who once commanded boardrooms and closed deals worth millions now looked like someone who'd been living rough for years. His transformation from wealth to poverty was so complete that former colleagues would have walked past him without a second glance, mistaking him for just another homeless person struggling through existence. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost significant weight. His face had hollowed until his cheekbones cast shadows, his eyes sunken deep into skull. His hair had gone almost completely grey and hung long past his collar because haircuts cost money better spent on food or bus fare. His hands were rough and scarred, permanently dirty under the nails from work and sleeping in places without proper facilities. He walked with a slight limp from an injury sustained on a construction site, an accident that happened when exhaustion made him careless. The world treated him with increasing cruelty as his appearance deteriorated. In the bus station, where he tried to sleep sitting upright on hard plastic chairs, a security guard woke him with a sharp kick to his foot and told him to leave, calling him a vagrant who was making real customers uncomfortable. Nick showed the guard Laura's photograph out of habit, asking if he had seen her, and the guard laughed with genuine amusement. He said that no woman who looked like that would have anything to do with a man who looked like Nick did now. That whatever relationship Nick imagined they had was clearly delusion or fantasy. The comment lodged in Nick's chest like a blade because he feared it might be true. What if he did find Laura and she was horrified by what he had become? What if his appearance disgusted her so thoroughly that she refused to listen to anything he needed to say? He pushed those thoughts away because entertaining them meant surrendering to despair, and despair was a luxury he could not afford. He found work washing dishes at a diner where the pay was terrible, but at least came with one free meal per shift. The cook was a bitter man who enjoyed cruelty in small doses, and he latched onto Nick as a target for his mockery. The cook overheard Nick showing Laura's picture to customers during his break, and he started a rumor among the staff that Nick was a stalker chasing a woman who had escaped an abusive relationship. The other workers began treating Nick with suspicion and hostility, whispering when he entered rooms and falling silent when he approached. Nick tried to explain that Laura was his wife, that he was searching for her because he loved her. But his explanations only seemed to confirm their suspicions. The manager pulled him aside and said the diner could not employ someone who made customers uncomfortable, that several people had complained about the desperate man, showing women's pictures and asking invasive questions. Nick was fired on the spot and left without arguing because defending himself required energy better spent walking to the next town. The cruelty of strangers became routine. Children were often the worst, their mockery unfiltered by adult restraint. In a shopping area where Nick sat on a bench studying Laura's photograph like he did every day, a group of teenagers noticed him and approached with phones already recording. They asked if he was homeless, if he was crazy, if he was some kind of pervert staring at women's pictures. When Nick quietly explained he was looking for his wife, they erupted in laughter so loud that other shoppers stopped to watch the spectacle. One teenager grabbed the photograph from Nick's hands and held it up, comparing Nick's haggard appearance to the beautiful woman in the image. He asked with theatrical disbelief how someone who looked like a diseased beggar ever convinced someone like her to marry him. The others laughed and encouraged more mockery, and the teenager threw the photograph back at Nick like it was contaminated by his touch. They walked away, still laughing, their voices echoing through the space, and several onlookers shook their heads at Nick like he was something pathetic and shameful. Nick picked up the photograph with shaking hands. The teenagers had creased it badly, and he spent several minutes carefully smoothing out the damage, treating the image with reverence because it was the only tangible connection to Laura he still possessed. He pressed the photograph against his chest and allowed himself one moment of complete despair, one moment where he acknowledged that this search might never end, that he might die on these streets having failed. The moment passed. He stood up and continued walking because giving up was not an option his heart would permit. In a small town, Nick encountered an old man who actually stopped to study Laura's photograph carefully. Hope surged through Nick until the old man looked up with pity, saturating his expression. The old man told a story about his own wife who had left him decades ago, how he spent 10 years searching before finally accepting she was gone forever. He said Nick looked like a ghost of a man, that the search was killing him slowly, that some people were meant to slip through your fingers no matter how tightly you tried to hold on. The old man walked away shaking his head, and Nick stood frozen on that street corner, feeling the weight of those words. But he rejected the old man's conclusion because Laura was not lost forever. She was just hidden, and finding her was only a matter of time and persistence, and refusing to accept defeat. He experienced countless small humiliations. In a coffee shop where he saved enough money to buy one small coffee, needing the warmth and caffeine after walking all morning in rain, he sat in a corner with Laura's picture. A group of college students sat nearby and noticed him. One of them stood up, walked over with false confidence fueled by his friend's attention, and dropped a dollar bill on Nick's table. He said loudly that Nick looked like he needed it more than them. His friends burst into laughter, and Nick felt every eye in the coffee shop turned toward him. Nick looked at the dollar, then at the young man's face full of privileged cruelty, and said nothing. He left the coffee shop without touching the money, feeling humiliation burn through him, but refusing to let it extinguish his determination. 7 months into his search, Nick's body was failing in ways he could no longer ignore. He had developed a persistent cough that rattled in his chest and sometimes brought up blood. His limp had worsened to the point where walking long distances caused significant pain. He lost more weight despite his body having little left to lose. He knew he should seek medical attention, but medical care cost money and time, and both were resources he could only dedicate to finding Laura. People increasingly treated him as mentally ill rather than simply desperate. A social worker approached him in a park where he sat studying Laura's photograph and offered services for homeless individuals. She asked his name, and when he said Nick Brock, she wrote it down without any recognition, without realizing she was talking to someone who once appeared in business magazines and news programs. She offered him a bed at a shelter, and Nick declined. She pressed, saying that he looked seriously ill, that life on the streets would kill him if he did not accept help. Nick showed her Laura's picture and tried to explain, but he saw her expression shift to the particular wariness people develop around those they consider dangerously delusional. The social worker backed away slowly and left, and Nick understood he had crossed some invisible line in people's perception. He was no longer a man on a difficult quest, but a mentally unstable vagrant chasing fantasies. The distinction did not matter to him, because other people's perceptions could not change the truth. Laura existed. His love was real. Their 30 days together had transformed him into someone who would never stop searching, regardless of how the world judged his choices. 8 months in, Nick was barely surviving. He had almost no money left. He ate every other day when he could afford food, sometimes stretching to every 3rd day when work was scarce. His body consumed itself for energy, leaving him skeletal and weak. But every morning he forced himself to stand up and keep moving, because Laura was out there somewhere, and finding her was the only thing that mattered anymore. Chapter 8. The Darkest Descent. 9 months into his search, Nick Brock reached a state that could barely be called living. His body operated on the edge of complete failure, held together by will rather than adequate nutrition or rest. His cough had evolved into something that rattled his entire frame and left him gasping for breath. His limp forced him to walk slowly, each step requiring conscious effort. His hands shook constantly from malnutrition and exhaustion. He looked decades older than his actual age, his face a landscape of suffering etched in deep lines and hollow shadows. He no longer bothered with mirrors because seeing his reflection served no purpose except to confirm what he already knew. He had become a ghost of his former self, a warning about obsession, a cautionary tale that people would tell about the dangers of refusing to accept loss. But Nick did not care about warnings or caution. He cared only about covering more ground, asking more people, following any thread that might lead to Laura. His money had run out completely. He survived by taking whatever work desperate men took when legitimate employment was not available. He sorted through garbage for recyclables he could sell. He stood on street corners with cardboard signs asking for help. He slept wherever he could find shelter from weather, in doorways and under bridges and in abandoned buildings that smelled like decay and despair. He ate from restaurant dumpsters when hunger became unbearable, learning which establishments threw out food that was still edible and which nights they disposed of their waste. The degradation should have broken him, but somehow it clarified his purpose instead. Stripped of everything comfortable and familiar, Nick understood himself more clearly than he ever had while wealthy. He was not defined by money or status or achievement. He was defined by love and the willingness to sacrifice everything for that love. In some strange way, losing everything made him feel more authentically himself than he had felt in years. On a particularly brutal evening, Nick collapsed on a sidewalk. His body simply gave out, legs buckling without warning, vision narrowing to a tunnel before expanding back to show pavement rushing toward his face. He lay there unable to move, while people stepped around him like he was a piece of litter someone should have removed. Eventually, a woman with kind eyes crouched beside him and asked if he needed help. Nick tried to speak but could only manage a whisper. She gave him water from her own bottle and offered to call an ambulance. Nick refused with what little strength he possessed. Hospitals meant questions and identification and time wasted when he should be searching. He showed the kind woman Laura's photograph, his hands trembling so badly he could barely hold it steady. He asked if she had seen this woman, his voice breaking on each word. The woman looked at the photo for a long moment, then looked back at Nick's ravaged face, and tears filled her eyes. She told him she had never seen Laura, but whoever this woman was, she would be heartbroken to see what he had become searching for her. The woman pressed $20 into Nick's palm and walked away quickly, wiping at her eyes. Nick stared at the money and felt guilt because he should have saved it for printing more copies of Laura's picture or for bus fare to search new areas. But his body demanded fuel, so he bought food and ate it mechanically while hating himself for the weakness. Work became increasingly difficult to find because employers took one look at his appearance and decided he was too sick, too unstable, too likely to collapse mid-shift. A grocery store owner felt sorry for him and let him stock shelves overnight for cash. Nick worked through fever and dizziness, his hands shaking as he arranged products. The owner's wife brought him soup and begged him to rest, saying he was clearly dying on his feet. Nick thanked her but did not rest. He finished his shift and left before dawn to continue showing Laura's picture in yet another unfamiliar town. 10 months into his search, Nick experienced something close to hallucination. He was walking through a shopping district, exhausted and feverish, when he saw Laura. She stood outside a bookstore with her back toward him, her hair the exact shade he remembered, her posture unmistakably hers. His heart stopped. His breath caught. He ran toward her, or tried to, his body managing only an awkward, shambling jog. He called her name, his voice hoarse and desperate. The woman turned around, and she was not Laura. She looked nothing like Laura except for hair color. The stranger stared at Nick with alarm and hurried away. Nick stood in the middle of the sidewalk, feeling the crushing weight of disappointment, and he understood that his mind was betraying him now, creating mirages where none existed. But he also understood that he would investigate every mirage, chase every false lead, because missing the real Laura by assuming she was another hallucination was a risk he would never take. 11 months in, Nick was holding himself together through sheer force of will. His body had aged decades in less than a year. His face looked ancient, despite being only in his early 40s. His hands shook constantly. His cough produced blood regularly. He needed medical attention desperately, but continued refusing it. Because every day mattered, every hour counted, every moment spent not searching felt like time stolen from his purpose. He wandered through cities whose names blurred together, showing Laura's picture to strangers who mostly ignored him. He slept in places that barely qualified as shelter. He ate when he could afford food and went hungry when he could not. He worked odd jobs that paid just enough to keep him moving forward. His expensive shoes had worn through and been replaced by cheap ones that gave him blisters. His clothes were held together with patches and stubbornness. People mocked him regularly now. His appearance invited cruelty from those who measured human worth by material success. In one memorable encounter, teenagers filmed themselves dumping iced coffee over his head while he sat on a bench holding Laura's photograph. They laughed and ran away while Nick wiped sticky liquid from his face and carefully dried the picture with his shirt. The photograph was permanently stained now, damaged beyond repair, but Laura's smile was still visible. He pressed it against his chest and let himself acknowledge that this search might be impossible, that Laura might never be found, that he might die on these streets, having failed the only mission that mattered. The moment of despair passed, as it always did. He stood up and kept walking because his heart would not accept surrender. That night, Nick slept in an alley behind a restaurant. He woke to find a homeless man rifling through his bag. Nick had nothing of value except spare clothes and Laura's picture, but he fought anyway, his body moving on instinct despite its weakness. The man punched Nick in the face, splitting his lip, and ran off with the bag. Nick lay in the alley bleeding and for several minutes considered just staying there, just letting exhaustion and sickness take him. Then he remembered the thief had taken Laura's picture. Pure rage gave him strength. He forced himself up and searched through dark streets, asking other homeless people if they had seen the thief. Eventually, an older woman told him where the man usually slept. Nick found him in an abandoned building, already unconscious, the bag beside him. Nick retrieved his belongings, including Laura's picture, which was mercifully undamaged. He left everything else for the thief because he understood desperation in ways he never had when wealthy. As the calendar approached 1 full year of searching, Nick's body was giving unmistakable signals that it could not continue much longer. But his determination had calcified into something unbreakable. He would search until his body literally stopped functioning, and maybe even then his spirit would continue wandering, looking for Laura in whatever existence came after this one. Chapter 9. The Edge of Giving Up. 12 months after Laura disappeared, Nick Brock existed somewhere between living and dying, his body held together by nothing except the fire burning in his chest that refused to be extinguished. He had aged, so dramatically that strangers who looked at him saw a man in his 60s rather than someone barely into his 40s. His face had become a landscape of suffering, every line carved by hunger and exhaustion and the relentless refusal to surrender. His eyes remained alert despite being sunken deep into his skull, still scanning every crowd for the one face that mattered more than his own survival. He found himself in a city whose name he could not remember, having arrived through some combination of walking and hitchhiking and cheap bus rides that blurred together in his memory. The days had stopped feeling separate and distinct, merging, instead, into one continuous moment of searching and surviving and choosing to continue when every rational voice screamed at him to stop. His cough had evolved into something that rattled his entire frame and sometimes left him gasping for air that would not come. His limp forced him to rest frequently, leaning against walls while his body trembled and his vision narrowed. His hand shook so violently that holding Laura's photograph required both hands and careful concentration. On what felt like the 10,000th Saturday of his search, Nick stood outside a large shopping mall, watching crowds flow through glass doors like water moving around an obstacle. He had learned through painful experience that busy public spaces offered the best chance of finding someone, because so many people passed through them, because visibility meant possibility. He held a piece of cardboard on which he had written, "Looking for my wife," above a crude drawing of Laura that barely captured her beauty but was the best he could manage. Her actual photograph had become too damaged to show anymore. The image, stained and creased and fading from constant handling, but he kept it in his pocket, pressed against his heart where it belonged. People walked past him like he was invisible, or perhaps like he was something they deliberately chose not to see. Hours passed, while Nick stood in the same spot, his legs aching from standing, his body swaying occasionally when dizziness threatened to drop him. The cold bit through his inadequate clothes and settled into his bones. His stomach cramped from hunger he had learned to ignore. His throat hurt from the cough that never fully left. Everything hurt, actually. Existing hurt. Breathing hurt. But giving up would hurt worse, so he stayed. A security guard approached him in the early afternoon and told him to move along, that he was making customers uncomfortable, that the mall had policies against panhandling. Nick tried to explain that he was not asking for money, just looking for his wife, but the guard did not care about distinctions. He threatened to call the police if Nick did not leave immediately. Nick moved to the edge of the property line, just far enough to avoid arrest, but close enough to still watch the entrance, and he resumed his vigil. More hours passed. The winter sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades that reminded Nick of Switzerland and Laura's paintings and everything beautiful he had lost. His body was giving him increasingly urgent signals that it could not continue much longer. His vision kept blurring. His legs felt like they might buckle without warning. His chest hurt with each breath. He knew somewhere beneath the determination that his body was failing, that he was possibly dying, that this search had extracted a price his physical form could no longer pay. He looked down at his cardboard sign and his crude drawing of Laura and felt despair threatening to overwhelm him for the first time in months. What if everyone was right? What if this search was impossible? What if Laura had left the country or changed her identity so completely that recognition was beyond possibility? What if he died on this street corner, having searched everywhere except the one place she actually was? The questions circled in his mind like vultures waiting for him to fall. Nick lowered his sign and leaned against the cold brick wall of the mall, his body grateful for the support. He closed his eyes and let himself imagine giving up. He pictured walking away from this corner, finding a shelter that would take him in, accepting that some people were meant to slip through your fingers no matter how desperately you tried to hold on. He imagined calling Patricia and admitting defeat. He imagined learning to live with the hole in his chest where Laura used to be. The fantasy lasted less than a minute before he rejected it completely. He opened his eyes and looked at the photograph he had pulled from his pocket without conscious thought. Laura smiled back at him from the damaged image, and Nick remembered Switzerland and the way she had looked at him, like he was her entire world. He remembered her confession about the miscarriages and the grief she carried alone, because he was too absent to share her burden. He remembered the 30 days that had reminded him what love actually meant, what marriage should have been, what he had thrown away in pursuit of things that meant nothing. He could not give up. Giving up meant betraying her twice, first by abandoning her during their marriage, and again by abandoning the search when it became difficult. Giving up meant accepting that comfort and survival mattered more than love and devotion. Giving up meant admitting that everyone was right when they said he should stop, that his search was madness, that Laura did not want to be found. And Nick knew in the deepest part of himself that they were wrong. Laura had not disappeared because she stopped loving him. She disappeared because she loved him too much, because she thought his love came from pity rather than truth, because she was protecting him from having to reject her. Nick pushed himself away from the wall and felt his body protest every movement. He lifted his cardboard sign again, even though his arms shook from the effort. He resumed his position watching the mall entrance, even though standing felt like torture. He chose to continue because continuing was the only choice that honored what Laura meant to him. The only choice that proved his love was as real as he claimed. The sun continued its descent, and the sky darkened toward evening. The crowds thinned as people headed home to families and warm houses, and lives that did not involve standing in the cold, searching for someone who might not exist in this city at all. Nick's body reached a state beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, beyond anything he had previously experienced. He was operating on will alone, his physical form simply obeying because his spirit refused to release it. He was preparing to move to a different location, thinking maybe he should try the other entrance or perhaps walk to a different area entirely, when something happened that he could not explain rationally. A feeling washed over him that had no logical source, a whisper in his mind that carried absolute certainty despite having no evidence to support it. The whisper said one word that changed everything. Wait. Nick froze with his foot raised mid-step. The whisper came again, stronger this time, more insistent. Stay, wait, just a little longer. He had no reason to obey the whisper. He had no reason to believe this location was special, or that this moment mattered more than any of the thousands of other moments he had spent searching. But something beyond reason, something that lived deeper than logic or evidence, told him that if he left now, he would regret it for whatever remained of his life. So he stayed. He lowered his foot back to the ground and resumed his position. His body swayed from exhaustion, but he locked his knees and refused to fall. His vision blurred, but he blinked it clear and kept watching. His hands shook, but he held the cardboard sign steady. He stayed because the whisper asked him to stay. Because intuition sometimes knows things that rational mind cannot explain. Because he had come too far and sacrificed too much to leave before the story finished itself. The sky continued darkening. Lights came on in the parking lot and inside the mall. The last shoppers trickled out carrying bags and chatting about ordinary things. Nick stood like a statue, like a monument to stubborn devotion, like a man who had become his purpose so completely that nothing else existed except the search. And then, in the last light of a day that felt like every other day, in a moment that seemed no different from thousands of other moments, Nick saw movement near the mall entrance that made his heart stop beating. A woman walked toward the doors with her head down, her hair different but her walk unmistakable. And Nick's soul recognized her before his mind could fully process what his eyes were showing him. Laura Wood was 20 feet away from him, alive, real, there. Chapter 10. The finding. Every cell in Nick's body recognized her simultaneously. 12 months of searching, 12 months of degradation and transformation and refusing to surrender, all compressed into a single moment when everything made sense, when the universe aligned, when the purpose that had consumed him became the miracle he had stopped believing in, but never stopped searching for. His voice left him completely for one eternal second. Then it returned with force that came from the deepest part of his being, from the place that held every moment of missing her, every hour of searching, every day of choosing to continue when everyone said to stop. Laura. The name emerged as a whisper. Laura. Louder now. Laura! A shout that carried everything he had been holding for 12 months. She turned toward the sound of her name, her face showing confusion that transformed into shock, then into horror, then into something that looked like her heart was breaking in real time. Her eyes locked onto his ravaged face, and Nick watched her expression cycle through disbelief and recognition and devastating comprehension. Her hand flew to her mouth, her face drained of all color, her eyes filled with tears that immediately began falling. Nick moved toward her, and his body obeyed, despite having nothing left to give. He pushed through the small crowd, his eyes never leaving her face, terrified that if he blinked she might disappear like every hallucination, like every false hope, like every moment over 12 months when he thought he saw her, but was wrong. His legs carried him forward through sheer force of will, through stubbornness that had kept him alive this long, through love that was stronger than his body's failure. Laura, Laura, Laura. He kept saying her name like a prayer, like an incantation that would keep her solid and real and there. Laura stood frozen for one moment longer, her face a portrait of shock and grief and guilt so profound it looked physical. Then she moved toward him, and when their paths finally converged after 12 months of separation, when Nick reached her and his body gave out completely, when his legs buckled and he fell at her feet like a man reaching the end of a pilgrimage, the world narrowed to just the two of them, and nothing else existed. He collapsed onto the concrete, and Laura dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over him like she was afraid touching him might shatter him into pieces. She was crying so hard her entire body shook. Her hands finally touched his face, his hair, his shoulders, moving over him like she was confirming he was real and not some ghost conjured by her guilt. "What did you do?" Laura's voice broke completely. "Oh God, what did you do to yourself? Nick, what have I done to you?" Nick looked up at her through vision blurred by tears and fever and relief, so overwhelming it felt like dying and being reborn simultaneously. He tried to speak but could only manage broken fragments, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heart hammering. "Found you. Had to find you. 12 months. Every city, every street. Never stopped. Not pity, never pity. Love you, always loved you, real, my love is real." Laura pulled him into her arms, holding his wasted body against her chest, and Nick felt her heartbeat beneath his ear, that sound he had been searching for, that rhythm that meant home. She was sobbing into his hair, repeating the same words over and over between gasps. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Oh God, I'm so sorry. What have I done? What have I done to you?" Around them a crowd had gathered. Phones were raised recording the scene. Voices murmured questions. But Nick heard none of it because the entire universe had contracted to the space where Laura held him, where her arms wrapped around him, where her tears fell onto his face and mixed with his own. Mall security pushed through the crowd, asking if everything was all right, if they needed help, their voices carrying concern and confusion. Laura looked up at them with an expression so fierce it stopped them mid-sentence. "This is my husband. Call an ambulance right now. Do it now." The authority in her voice surprised Nick because it was strength he had not known she possessed. The security guards moved immediately, speaking urgently into radios. Laura looked back down at Nick and he saw everything in her eyes. She saw what the search had cost him. She understood what his appearance meant. She recognized the sacrifice he had made. "You aged 20 years searching for me." Her voice shattered on each word. "You look like you are dying. You destroyed yourself. Why? Why would you do this?" Nick gathered what remained of his strength and spoke with as much clarity as his damaged voice would allow. These were the words he had walked thousands of miles to say, the confession he had starved and suffered to deliver, the truth that mattered more than his own survival. "Because you are everything. You have always been everything. I forgot for 5 years and I am sorry. But Switzerland reminded me. Losing you taught me. Your lie showed me how desperate you were, how completely I had failed you. When Patricia told me you were alive, I did not feel betrayed. I felt grateful. Grateful you were breathing somewhere. Grateful I could search for you. I would search another 12 months. I would age another 20 years. I would die searching if that is what it took. Because my love is real, not pity, not obligation, real. You thought I loved you because I thought you were dying, but you were wrong. I love you because you are Laura, because you are mine, because you are the only thing that ever mattered, and I was too blind to see it until I almost lost you forever." Laura was sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. She pulled him closer, holding him like he might disappear if she loosened her grip even slightly. Her voice came out in broken pieces between sobs. I lied to you about dying. I manipulated you. I thought you would hate me when you learned the truth. I thought your love came from guilt, so I disappeared before you could reject me. I never imagined anyone would sacrifice everything for me. I never believed your love was this real, but you destroyed yourself to prove it. You gave up everything, your wealth, your health, your life, for me. For the chance to tell me you loved me. Nick lifted his hand to her face, his fingers trembling as they touched her cheek, tracing the tears that continued falling. I would do it again, 1,000 times. Every city walked, every night hungry, every moment of suffering. Worth it, all worth it. To be here, to see you, to tell you. Worth everything. The ambulance arrived with sirens that seemed too loud for the moment. Paramedics pushed through the crowd and immediately began assessing Nick's condition, while Laura refused to release his hand. They asked questions about his medical history, and Laura answered what she could while staying pressed against his side. One paramedic quietly told Laura that Nick was severely malnourished, critically dehydrated, likely suffering from multiple infections and pneumonia, that his body had been pushed beyond what humans were designed to survive. They needed to get him to a hospital immediately. As they lifted Nick onto a stretcher, he kept his eyes locked on Laura, memorizing her face. Terrified this was another hallucination that would dissolve when he blinked. She walked beside the stretcher holding his hand, her face still wet with tears, her voice steady now as she spoke to him. I love you. I have always loved you. I will never leave you again. We are going to grow old together the way we always should have. This is not the end. This is our beginning. In the ambulance, Laura sat beside Nick while paramedics worked to stabilize him. She talked constantly, her voice anchoring him when his body wanted to surrender. She told him about her year working at the mall, about watching him from a distance, about the apartment she rented and the paintings she created while thinking about him. She confessed that not one day passed without missing him, without questioning her choice to leave. At the hospital, doctors worked on Nick for hours while Laura refused to leave the waiting room. When they finally emerged saying he was stable but would need extensive recovery, Laura wept with relief, so intense it felt like collapsing. She was allowed to see him, and she found Nick asleep, connected to machines and IV lines. She pulled a chair beside his bed and took his hand in both of hers. You proved that love is not about perfect moments, she whispered to his sleeping form. Love is about searching when everyone says to stop. Love is about destroying yourself if that is what it takes to prove your devotion is real. You taught me what love actually means. When Nick woke hours later, the first thing he saw was Laura's face. She smiled through fresh tears and squeezed his hand. Welcome back, Nick smiled weakly. Never left. Just took a detour to find you. Over the following weeks, Nick recovered slowly, while Laura never left his side. They talked about everything that happened during their year apart. They cried together and laughed together and began rebuilding what they had almost lost forever. When Nick was finally released, they did not return to his mansion. Instead, Laura took him to her small apartment where they learned to be partners instead of strangers. Months later, they returned to Switzerland and renewed their vows in the chapel where they had lit candles for their lost babies. This time, there were no lies between them. When the priest asked if Nick would love Laura in sickness and health, Nick spoke with a voice that held every moment of his search. I will love her when she is healthy and when she is sick. I will love her when she is visible and when she is not. I will love her until the day I die, and probably beyond that too. Years later, they lived in a small house filled with Laura's paintings and the ordinary chaos of a life built on truth. They had a daughter who had Nick's eyes and Laura's smile. They grew old together, holding hands while walking, cooking side by side, falling asleep tangled together. And when people asked Nick about the grey hair and aged face that made him look older than his years, he would smile and look at Laura with wonder still visible in his eyes. I destroyed myself to find her, he would say. And in destroying myself, I discovered who I actually was. I found her, and I found myself, and we built something real from the ruins." Laura would squeeze his hand and whisper, "Thank you for finding me. Thank you for refusing to give up. Thank you for loving me enough to sacrifice everything." And Nick would hold her tighter and whisper back, "I would do it again. Every city, every night hungry, every moment of suffering, all of it was worth finding you." Their love was not perfect. It was scarred and complicated, and built on lies and failures and desperation. But it was real. It was theirs. And it proved that the greatest love stories are not about people who never struggle, but about people who struggle and choose each other anyway, who search until they find what was lost, who rebuild what was broken into something stronger than before. They loved each other until the end of their days. And when Nick finally died decades later, Laura held his hand and whispered the same words she had whispered every night of their lives together. "Thank you for finding me when I was lost. Thank you for showing me what love truly means. Thank you for proving that some people are worth destroying yourself to find." And somewhere, in whatever exists beyond this life, Nick smiled and whispered back one final time, "Worth it. Every moment. Worth everything."